We are our background and circumstances, our genetics. We are the things we lived through and survived. We're the things we aspire to and hope for. So who you are, who we are, is this profound mystery, and to reduce ourselves to our worst behaviors is not only unhelpful, it's inaccurate, it's not true.
Hello everybody, I think we're live. Welcome to the Impact Suite Wellness Series. This month we're going to be talking about navigating urges, what to do when we want things that hurt us. My name is Clay Olsen. I am the CEO and founder of Impact Suite, and I've got here with me, and I'm excited to introduce to you Christian Lippert, who is on a part of our team. He's one of our key content writers and content experts and researchers. And you've also got a master's in communication studies.
That's right.
And you're just fascinated, you've been fascinated for many years around just human behavior. And so when you got this assignment to kind of come on and talk about this, you were
giddy.
You were quite excited.
Yeah,
right?
I'm excited to be here.
So,
yeah.
So we're excited to have him join us. We're going to be talking about this. Let's dive in. And of course, I just want to remind all of you who are watching live that we will be taking questions at the end. So if we're talking about things that interest you or that you have curiosities about, go ahead and put them in the chat. And our team, who's off camera here, will feed those questions to us at the end. So feel free to participate. Christian, let's dive in.
Awesome. Excited to be here.
Let's talk about urges and navigating those, and how to talk about addiction and broaden that scope a little bit.
Yeah, great. So the context of our conversation, as we've talked about, is that when we're talking about addiction, our minds often go to like the most extreme clinical version of addiction, but addiction happens across a whole spectrum. So today what we're talking about is relevant. We're going to talk about 3 principles that are relevant for the entire spectrum, from bad habits that are a little bit annoying to these addictions that are ruining your life and hurting the lives of the people you love.
Yeah, I think that's a good, an important clarification, because I think that a lot of times when we talk about the word addiction, which culturally we can sometimes overuse the term addiction, and many people from the clinical world get uncomfortable when we use the term when maybe a habit or a compulsion might be more appropriate to define it literally. Sure. But I think that what we want to help the viewers understand is that regardless of what you call it on the spectrum of struggle,
right,
these are things that can trip us up. These things can really harm our progress, and rather than thinking about it like, where is the line so that I can like inch close to it, and as long as I'm not clinically addicted, I'm going to be okay. Rather than thinking of it like that, just think of it like, hey, what is kind of tripping us up from thriving in life, right?
Right. And what are the things that I continue to do even though I know they hurt me? They're not good for me.
Yeah.
And so we're exploring some of the underlying foundational work we can do to navigate that more effectively.
Yeah.
So the 3 main points we're going to hit today in our conversation are first talking about building awareness around our habits and what's formulated our challenges. Then we're going to talk about building willingness. How do you have more motivation to change? And we'll end by talking about how do we build systems that don't just rely on willpower, that aren't just about like force yourself to stop doing the things that are bad for you. So that's kind of the direction we're going. That sound okay with you, boss
sounds
man?
Great. Let's dive in.
Awesome. So first, talking about the importance of getting real with where you're at. I love this quote by Eckhart Tolle. Awareness is the greatest agent for change. I have a Boy Scout background, and
are you an Eagle Scout?
I am an Eagle Scout.
Congratulations.
To build my credibility for our crowd. Thank you. And talking about like orienteering or compass and map work, some of the most foundational things are not only to know where you want to go, of course that's important, but knowing where you want to go isn't enough. You have to know where you're at.
Yeah.
And if I were to ask you or ask our audience, like, what's the hardest problem to solve? I'm sure we'd get a lot of great answers. There's like math problems that are historically difficult to solve, or problems like selfishness or poverty that are really big and complicated and hairy. I think a really good answer as well for what's the hardest problem to solve is the one that you don't know is a problem, or the one that you don't think is a problem, right? And these things can kind of haunt us. So we're going to dive in about a couple tips for getting really grounded in the reality of your circumstance.
Yeah, and understanding that you are not that struggle, right?
Yeah.
Like who you are versus where you are.
That's one of the main points that we're going to hit on. Yeah, exactly. So first, talking about when we look at these this broad spectrum. So we're talking here from eating and eating things that are bad for you and not eating well, to using video games, to, of course, like alcohol and drugs, and this whole spectrum of things we turn to. We have to investigate the root causes. We have this tendency to zero in and focus on the behavior and treat it like it exists in a vacuum. But of course it doesn't. Like, our lives are interwoven with these things, so we have to get familiar with the broader context around some of these issues. So one of the great ways to do that is to explore our habit loops. Researcher Dr. Judson Brewer has written 2 excellent books, The Craving Mind, and the other book he's written is called Unwinding Anxiety. And he explores how, like, our brains are created to build habits through reward-based learning. And those habit loops have 3 different parts. There's a trigger of some sort. There's the behavior. In this case, we're focusing on some of our addictive or destructive actions. And then there's a result. And when there's a reward in that result, then our brain learns to pair behavior with that reward, so the next time we go into that more easily. And that's not a bad thing.
No.
Habits are great.
Yeah, that can lead us to, positive habits can help us and help us, live healthier lifestyles.
Sure.
It can help us in our relationships, can help us in a number of different ways. And I think that we can all think of things that we do that are, positive habits.
Right.
The connections that we have with our children in the morning when we get up, and we eat breakfast in the morning. These are all positive things that can help us. Obviously, this process can help lead us down some negative paths.
Right. When our brain makes this association with something that actually is hurting us and thinking it's doing something positive. So gaining some awareness around that. Throughout our slideshow, our presentation today, we've got questions to help the audience reflect back on themselves and find relevance. So here's a couple questions when it comes to investigating root causes. What's the broader circumstance surrounding this behavior? So for my example, like, I've had a sugar sweet tooth my entire life. I feel like I'm battling wanting to eat all the sweet things all the time. But then if I look at that, like, separate from the context of my life, then I'm limited in understanding it. I'm the 3rd of 6 kids. The first 4 were boys. And mealtime, like, we always had enough to eat, but it was like, you got to hurry so you can be the first to dessert. And
for us, it was like, in order to get seconds, because I'm the 5th of 7.
Yeah.
And if you wanted seconds of anything, mashed potatoes or whatnot, you had to eat fast.
Yeah.
And so, I have that trigger as well.
And to this day, like, I'm sitting with my wife and I'm eating like it's a competition. Like, someone's going to take the plate away from me. Like, I don't own a fridge that I can store leftovers in, or like someone, because of my family growing up, it was like, if it's in the fridge, it's fair game. So if you want it, like, you get it now, you get it fast, you get leftovers, and the first thing to go are desserts. So, like, I have this context, right, that makes sense for why I would get into this habit of thinking, like, having a scarcity mindset around sugar and sweets and wanting to, like, eat it all right now because maybe it's going to disappear on me or something. Another good question to consider is, like, what am I trying to escape or avoid? Because my issue isn't actually about sugar. It has to do more for me about stress. Like, I turn to sweets when I'm feeling worried or anxious and stressed, because it does give you a little boost. It gives you a little high, and I've built that connection, that habit in my brain. So we have to ask, like, what are we trying to avoid? And it's loneliness, boredom, fear, anxiety, and these things are uncomfortable. They're hard. It makes sense that we try to avoid them and that we've turned to things that maybe help a little bit but don't actually serve us in the long run. A third question here is, what are the triggers and the rewards? So what's prompting this behavior, and what am I getting from it? Because when we pay really close attention to what it's giving us, then we can help our brains realize, like, that it's not actually giving us what we want in the long term.
Yeah, it's actually, in many cases, it's pulling us away from the very thing that we think we're chasing.
Yeah, when I like eat a whole cake in a setting, then that doesn't actually get rid of my stress. It makes me feel bad about myself, and things get worse. So paying attention to these things to get the broader scope of our behaviors, because we can't isolate our behaviors to a certain instance. We got to take in all the factors, which is why all of our apps focus on making lifestyle changes to help with mental health and addiction. So this next point, after we do this work, or while we're doing this work, it's so critical to separate our urges from our long-term desires. So with my food stuff, it's not helpful or productive for me to think, I am glutton. I am pig, I am sugar monster. Those things don't like help me change, right? I should have started with sugar monster. That's a little more, it tears you down, right? Yeah. So understanding that we are not our urges. Our urges, our cravings, our impulses, those don't define us. And it doesn't matter how often we've fallen into them, how long we've been trying to leave them behind. They don't define who you are, not really.
And I think that's a hard one for people to really buy into, because when you've been struggling with something for so long, when you've kind of allowed that to take over, a lot of people, particularly people that have struggled to the level of full-fledged clinical addiction, they start to think like, well, this is just who I am. Like, get with the program. Essentially, they're telling either themselves or their spouse or the people around them, kind of like, you need to love me for who I am, and this is part of who I am.
Right.
And this is, and I've embraced that. I need you to embrace that, so we can go on together in this path. And that's kind of like the path of least resistance mentally. Like, it's the one that, like, you can just kind of say, the road back is way too hard, and it's way too steep, and I don't even know where to begin. But if I just lean into this compulsion or addiction, and just kind of like acknowledge it as part of who I am, and people need to get on board, that feels like an easier path, even though it's the most destructive path.
Right.
And I think that separation of saying, you are not your struggle, you are not your addiction, and recognizing that who you are deep down is someone very different than maybe where you are right now in this struggle. Right. And that separation, and that can take some work to get to that place where you can actually separate that. But if you can, that unlocks an unbelievable amount of potential and power that you didn't know you had to overcome.
Yeah, it's making me think about, I think it begs the question, like, well, if we're not our urges, then what are we, right? And what a beautiful, complicated question. We're not our thoughts or our urges. We are our behaviors to some degree. We are our background and circumstances, our genetics. We are the things we've lived through and survived. We're the things we aspire to and hope for. So who you are, who we are, is this profound mystery, and to reduce ourselves to our worst behaviors is not only unhelpful, it's inaccurate. It's not true.
It's incredibly inaccurate and untrue. Yeah. And I think that we need to really push on that self-talk. If that's where we're at, we need to really push against that and find the truth of, like, we are not these behaviors. And this is also something that applies to parenting. A lot of times, in parenting books and parenting seminars, they talk about, your child is not their behaviors. Like, your child is good inherently, and wants to do good, and if you treat them as if they are their behaviors, that can, like, take you down a path of of viewing them in a very negative light. I know that my kids don't always behave. Shocker. My kids don't always behave, and if I treated them as their behaviors, well, then they would be little stinkers that lie and steal and don't share. But that's not who they are. Right. And if I treat them for who they truly are, their behaviors start to improve.
Right. Yeah, and thinking about that broader context of, like, what's promoting this behavior, because when your kid's tired, then their behavior isn't going to be as great as when they're well rested.
Kids it's really clean. It's really simple. It's like, if they're tired or if they're hungry, I mean, those are going to manifest in very negative ways, right? And if you can solve those two things, it's a night and day shift. At least it is in our home. And so as we look at, and I love how you framed it earlier, like, as we look at, well, what are causing these issues, rather than just kind of like looking at this one thing, like, fix this. I want to live my life exactly as I have been living, but fix this one piece of me. Right. Any clinician or therapist worth their weight would kind of like back up and say, okay, I get that that's what you want to fix, but we need to look at you holistically, because let's look at your nutrition. Let's look at your sleep. Let's look at some past trauma or relationships or needs that are not being met that are really driving some of these issues that you're having. And if we can get to the root of these, this will start to lose the seductive pull, and start to lose its control over you.
Right. So letting our behaviors be symptoms to other things going on, rather than thinking that our behaviors are necessarily the sickness itself or something like that.
Right. Beautiful.
So here's some questions as you're working through this progress. this process of separating our urges from desires, what do I believe about myself? That you're fundamentally good, that you're trying, that you can improve, and to what you were saying, do we believe that these poor behaviors or our addictions are proof that we're bad, or is it evidence that we're hurting, that we're looking for relief? There's much more generous and I think accurate ways of framing our struggles. So what do I believe about myself? What do I really want? And by really want, I'm talking about like long-term desires. What do you aspire to? What do you hope for? Because surely the things we want also are part of who we are. I love the example here, thinking about the Harry Potter series. I'm assuming you're familiar.
I've heard of it.
Yeah. So a young boy,
more.
Harry Potter, finds out that he's a wizard, and he goes to this magical school, and they have a ceremony where they're separated into different houses that all have different reputations, right?
Yeah.
Thanks for humoring me as I explained to you, Harry Potter. So they have this magic sorting hat that goes on their head and tells them where they belong, and these houses have different like characteristics. So when the sorting hat goes on Harry's head, he starts muttering like, "Not Slytherin, not Slytherin." He doesn't want to be part of this house that's kind of ruthless and brutal, and he's met somebody that he didn't like from it. And the sorting hat like takes that into consideration as it makes that decision. Like what Harry, there's parts of him that would fit into this other house that's a little more ruthless, a little more
ambitious.
Ambitious, yeah, thank you. I don't want to. I know there's people who are fierce defenders of Slytherin out there. But that matters. What we want matters. So even when all we can say is, honestly, what I want right now is this bad habit or this to return to this pattern, what do you want to want? And that matters. That's a point of change.
Yeah, and oftentimes in the addiction recovery world, that's referred to as like, what is your why statement?
Yeah.
Like, what is a statement that pulls you back to the core desires that you have? And for a lot of people, that can manifest in a family photo, like a strong family relationship, and some of these behaviors can really tear at the seams of that, and can really harm that relationship. Or it could be a way of living or a healthy lifestyle that you aspire to that you don't feel like you're living at the time. So what is the why statement that is like ultimately the thing that gets you out of bed and drives you to say, that is more important to me than this here right now? And if we bring it to something that many of us struggle with, like sugar, like today, this very morning, my whole family, all of my kids, well, I have 4 daughters and one of them is 2 weeks old, so I guess not my youngest daughter, but like the others, we all talked about a challenge for our family. And this was actually driven by my kids, to not eat sugar for the month of October up until Halloween. Halloween would be the breaker. I tried to get it past Halloween, but it didn't work. So up until Halloween, no sugar. And we were talking about kind of what was it going to look like and what the rules and boundaries were. But that's hard for us. My daughter will like sniff it out of like random cracks in the house. Like she is a sugar fiend, like you were describing yourself. And so for her to kind of like get on board with this was like shock. My wife and I were just looking at each other. But sugar is something that we all somewhat struggle with. And I think if we kind of look back to that and say, okay, what is there are people that struggle with very serious addictions. And I would say that we don't often classify sugar as an addiction, but I think that many of us do have an addiction to sugar.
Yeah, like as a society.
But what is more important to us than that? Just to use something that's very relatable to all of us. What's more important to us? What's more important to me than sugar? And I think about, I actually did a year without sugar, 1 year.
Hair flip.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was very difficult for the first 4 months.
Yeah.
It got really actually quite easy after that. But I felt amazing. I felt, and I remember, and I'm eating. I've been eating sugar as of late, and we'll see about how October goes. But at the end of that year, like I was feeling amazing, and I'm like, that's what I want. I no longer had the cravings. I no longer was like white knuckling through it. I was no longer at a place where like I felt like I was being deprived. I felt like I was like living my best life. Yeah. I was like, man. So I think back to that and think like, I want to go back to that. And a healthy body, a healthy mind, clarity of mind, and knowing that I can conquer something difficult. Those are all huge benefits to me foregoing something
Yeah.
that was like nipping at my heels all
Yeah.
the time, like
Awesome.
it is for so many of us.
That's a great example. That segues really well to this next point. We've got one last question here. Just what do you value? Which is what we've already been. What are my values? We've been talking around that too, to align yourself with your greatest aspirations and your values as a way of separating yourself from your current behavior. So this next point we're going to talk about is how do we cultivate willingness? How do we build motivation to change when change is hard? I love this quote by Simone Weil. She's a French philosopher. She says, "There's only two things that pierce the human heart. One is beauty, the other is affliction." And we're going to talk about those each in turn, which connects really well to the example you were giving about sugar. So when we are trying to change and build motivation to change any of these habits, it's important to really deeply understand how it's causing us suffering, how it's not working for us, and the things that the ways that it's harming us and harming people we love. So there's 3 questions up here for you all to consider, and myself as well. What are the costs of continuing this behavior to myself and to other people? Secondly, what am I afraid of? Both what am I afraid of will happen if I don't change, and what am I afraid of, what fears are keeping me from changing, and what lies ahead? And a related question of what am I tired of? What's not working for me about how things are? And it's an important thing to distinguish here that we're not talking about lumping more self-judgment and loathing on yourself for your behaviors. That doesn't work, that doesn't help, but really getting clear around how is this behavior hurting me, hurting people I love, not aligning with my values, and that can be a source of motivation for us.
Oh yes, yeah. I know there are individuals that are just wanting to throw in the towel with this, but if they get really honest with themselves with these types of questions, and start to really think through them, I think a light can start to appear at the end of the tunnel, where they can start to develop those desires that will, or identify rather those desires that will really pull them through that. It's a dark place to be, in a place where you just feel like there is no overcoming this. I've worked with addicts for many years now, and so many of them talk about a time in which they just felt like there was no hope. There was no path forward. They had tried this, they had tried that, they had gone to group, they had gone, attempted many times. Addicts, often by the time they actually get to the place where they are like overcoming their struggle, for many of them, it's their 10th time or 10th attempt or 11th attempt in going for it, and then something clicks, and oftentimes it has these roots that you're describing of like really getting clear with identifying those core desires that are like pulling them through, and identifying what they're fighting for.
Yeah, that's powerful. It's making me think about, I just watched the Lord of the Rings series with my younger sister, and we finished last night, and there's this moment where after so much struggle and suffering and pain, Frodo, the main character, has gotten the ring, the source of all evil, to the brink of where it can be destroyed. And then he chooses not to destroy it. And it's devastating. It's so hard to watch as an audience member that he chooses to turn back to this thing that's hurting him and hurting other people. But then there's this moment that I haven't noticed before watching, where after, through a series of events, the ring ends up being destroyed. Frodo is dangling off a cliff and reaching for his friend's hand, Sam's hand. And his friend says, "Don't you dare let go." And he tries one more time to grab his hand, and he pulls him up. And I was just thinking about like what it would be for this, of course, fictional character, but who's just come to terms with the fact that they couldn't change, even though everything, the fate of the world rested upon it, and they failed. It would have been so easy to think like, I'm not worth saving. I'm just going to let go. I'm tired of fighting. But the fact that Frodo, I think because his friend never stopped loving him, gives himself one more try. And then that's enough because things improve. So I think that courage to keep trying is so critical.
I love it. We've talked about Harry Potter,
Yep.
Lord of the Rings. I think Star Wars is next, so let's go to that one.
All right, here we come. So leaving affliction, and now we're moving to approaching beauty. And if Star Wars is your source of beauty, then awesome. Power to you. So this is the flip side, right? Things that are hard for us motivate us, but also the things that are beautiful. So here's some questions. What's worth running towards in your life?
Really answer that question. Really think about that.
Yeah.
Take inventory about what is worth running toward?
Right.
It may not be here with you at this moment, because we can all look at like the blessings around us and the beauty that it does surround us, but what's worth running toward? What's worth that energy?
Right. And not just what I'm told I should value, but the things that deeply, genuinely are beautiful to you and meaningful to you. And again, separating like the shame. If something that motivates a lot of people doesn't motivate you, maybe not for everyone. It's not like my family is enough of a motivation to change. And that's okay. You just have to find the motivation that really works for you. What's worth running towards? What inspires me? What am I changing for? With my sugar example, Affliction didn't provide enough motivation for me to try and change, because I'm young enough and I like moving enough that I haven't had like that many negative health things, or I just have been like eating sugar so long that I don't know what to contrast it to, right? So for me, motivation to keep trying to change comes from like thinking about what would be beautiful for me about this change. You talked about feeling better healthily.
And I didn't believe that until I experienced it.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I was like, baloney. And then I experienced it, I was like, holy cow, I have more energy.
Yeah.
I have more clarity of mind. I feel more fit. I
bet you slept better.
I
That
slept
also
better.
Yeah.
It was, and why did I stop that? I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
No, October,
You're
here
committed.
I come.
Here you come. Cool. For me, it was realizing like what's a beautiful idea to me is like, what if I don't have to fight my body all the time? What if my body isn't my enemy? What if I can learn to listen to my appetites more clearly, and that they'll let me know when too much is when I've had too much, or when I need to slow down, or whatever. This idea of having like a more harmonious relationship with my body and myself instead of feeling divided all the time, that idea is beautiful to me. And that's something that's motivating me to try and keep sticking with developing better habits with eating.
I think it's an interesting way that you talk about that. I had a friend, still a friend, and this individual struggled with sugar in that they didn't eat too much. When they had too much, their body very much let them know. They couldn't finish a cookie without getting headache or migraine, or a soda and at first I thought that was a curse. I was like, oh, that's terrible. Like, you can't even finish this cookie.
Yeah.
And then I realized how beautiful that was. Like, their body spoke to them. I've always said that my body and myself and my body are on, we're on non-speaking terms. We we don't communicate. Like, when I overeat, when I eat too much sugar, like, there's no alarms that go off. Like, my wife feels sick to her stomach, and she's like, why did I eat? I'm like, oh, I feel fine. Like, so I wish I had, I need to like learn to attune into what my body is saying to me. But like what you're saying is, I'm kind of on that extreme that I don't really feel those effects. And so I just feel like, come what may. But those that feel them and that really are in tune to how their body's reacting to certain either substances or foods or whatnot, and getting really clean with that, where it's not a fight but a harmonious union moving forward, like that can be beautiful.
And that can be learned and practiced too. Dr. Brewer has done fascinating research with helping people quit smoking through mindfulness, and just having people like pay really close attention to what it feels like to smoke, how it tastes, how it makes them feel in the exact moment, helps people cut drastically because it tastes bad. And it's not fun and it's not pleasant, but it's easy to forget that and not pay attention to it.
Yeah.
So paying attention to these things, we can cultivate that kind of capacity.
Beautiful.
So let's move on to this final section and point to talking about how do we build smart systems. I'm a big fan of Oscar Wilde. I think he's very witty and very insightful. And this quote is from him: "I can resist anything except temptation," which is of course like tongue-in-cheek, because what does that mean you're resisting if you're not resisting temptation? But I want to talk about some of the limits of willpower, because so often in these conversations we come back to the kind of like Nike, like you just have to do it. Drill sergeant yourself, like willpower is the answer, stop doing it. And willpower is important, and self-control is important, and we can develop and practice these things. They're really important, but they won't be enough for us ultimately.
No.
We can't rely on them and depend on them to save us. We got to make some smarter decisions and build some systems that don't rely on willpower alone. There's a great researcher, Dr. Katie Milkman, wrote a book called How to Change, and she's all about this. And she finds that there's in her book she describes how there's kind of two groups of people: those who successfully navigate change and build good habits and succeed, and those who don't. And one of the differences between them is that the people who are successful stop being kind of like naively optimistic that they're just going to have willpower enough one day. They accept the fact that laziness, procrastination, like anxiety, some of these things are like part of, or being, some of these anxious behaviors are part of the human condition, and we have to kind of accept it treat it like a chronic health condition. Meaning like, and people who are chronically optimistic and like, well, I'll just change tomorrow, they never put the plans in place and put the structures in place to support them to change.
Yeah.
So a few questions here to help with this. It's like, how do I navigate my human limitations? First, do I know them? And do I have, going back to our first point, do I have a clear view of the habits that I've fallen into, the behaviors that I have that aren't serving me? Second here, how can I make it harder to do the harmful thing? Dr. Milkman.
I love that one.
Yeah. Rather than making it easy, right? The phrase she uses, how do we up the price of our vice?
Mm-hmm.
So a simple example that people are familiar with, right? If your harmful behavior or the habit that you've fallen into that isn't serving you and is causing you problems is hitting the snooze button. Unplug your clock, put it on the other side of the room, and then in order to hit the snooze button, you have to get out of bed and walk over and hit the snooze button. So now it's not as easy as flipping over and hitting the button there. That's not like the only solution, right? Go to bed earlier. That would also help with getting up in the mornings, and there's all sorts of other things. But like make it harder to
But intentionally, like think of ways, like how can I put this further away? Like one thing is like, well, not having sugar in the home.
Sure.
Like that would make it harder to access it. So even when you have that sweet tooth craving at 10 p.m., you're just like, it's not accessible. You have to like get up, get into the car, go down to the local market, grab some sugar, and come back home. It's like, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
People that smoke, like I've heard of individuals that have committed to their spouse every time they light up a cigarette, that they are committed to paying them $25.
Yeah, putting money on the line.
Putting money on the line, and sometimes money speaks, right? And so like, and by that commitment, they know that like this cigarette costs a lot of money. Like it's not just what I purchased for it, which is actually quite expensive.
Right.
But I'm going to have to pay additionally, and my pride. Another thing is like, it's not worth it. I'm not going to do it. So there's a number of ways that you can kind of push this a little further out from you to make it more difficult. And I think being conscious of that and thinking and getting creative with that can really assist your efforts.
Sure. I think about if you want to watch less television and read more, then maybe like your TV shouldn't be the most prominent thing in your living room that all the couches are oriented towards, or your bedroom, right? Like there's ways we can make it. We for a while unplugged our TV, and it was like in an upstairs room. So if we wanted to watch something, it was a deliberate act that we planned out rather than our default behavior, because our brains, bless them, love the defaults to make our lives easier for us.
Yeah.
So we have to make the defaults more healthy for us.
Yeah.
So here's another question that's related. How do I make it easier to do something healthy? Dr. Milkman's suggestion, she names it temptation bundling is what she calls it. So take the thing that's good for you and combine it with something you like. Simple example, like you really want to watch your Netflix show, you can only make the rule for yourself that you can only watch it when you're on the treadmill. And then it's not so bad to walk or to jog, and you're combining this kind of treat with this behavior that's useful. For me, it's not that I never want to eat treats again. Like I'm not trying to get a better handle on it out of self-punishment or something. I love treats, and I want to love treats rather than because when I eat them without thinking about it, or when I'm not eating them to enjoy them, I'm eating them to try and fill this emotional void in me. It's not actually tasting good or feeling good. So some things for myself, I'm thinking maybe some of my rules around treats is that they're part of celebration. They're part of when I'm with other people celebrating an event. So they're special, not that they're just an endless supply of things that I'm trying to deal with my stress I don't actually fix. So how do we make it easier to do something healthy? Transitioning to this final point in building systems is talking about one of the paradoxes of trying to change ourselves. Is that no one can do it for you, and we can't do it alone. So you have to do it yourself, and you need other people to help you. We need community as we're trying to make changes. So a couple questions here. How can I connect with others? There's a reason that Alcoholics Anonymous and veterans groups and all these different communities have been so helpful in helping people find healing and connection, because being with people who understand what you're going through is encouraging and powerful and important. So how do I connect with other people?
And that's why we push really hard within the Impact Suite apps that we offer a community component. And if you don't make that, if you don't connect with others or have that human accountability or make that social, the likelihood of your success diminishes dramatically.
Yeah, you're right. So onto these second questions. So connection, how do I incorporate accountability? Just what you're talking about. How do I find other people to help me stay accountable? And lastly, how can I celebrate my progress? So like you've mentioned, we have this built into our apps with people that can celebrate with you and help keep you accountable, and coaches. There's a lot of different ways to do this. And in fact, the accountability piece is one of the ways of like increasing the price of our advice, right? Because if you need to be exercising and your friend is waiting on your doorstep for you, then suddenly like the price of disappointing your friend is it's a higher price to pay than just telling yourself in the morning like, I'll do something later, and hitting the snooze button. So there's a lot of ways that these things interact and overlap to help us make change.
Awesome. I love this. What a great conversation we've had. I know that there's been some questions that have come in, and we have just a little bit of time left to answer a couple of those. I know we're going to be pulling those up. But thank you for the time you spent in prepping some of this material. It's been I think very helpful for those watching, and for me even being a part of this conversation. So I appreciate that.
It's helpful for me too. As we transition to questions, maybe I can just offer a brief overview wrap up.
Go
so
ahead.
what we tried to talk about here was navigating urges, and the approach we took was talking about foundational work, right? So you need to get clear about what's going on for you. You need to build your motivation by, pay attention to the habits that we get into and what's causing them and these behaviors. We need to build our willingness through finding beautiful things and the things that are hurting us, and we need to build systems and support systems that don't rely on willpower. Of course, there's a whole nother conversation. There's way more to be said about all these things, and a conversation to be had about in the moment of having the urge. How do I navigate that?
So that's actually one of our questions. One thing I wanted to get into, but
Perfect.
I actually noticed that Tanner, one of our viewers today, is kind of hitting on that very point. It's like, we've talked a lot about fighting these urges in a general sense. What are the best ways to fight these urges in the moment? I have some thoughts, but I want to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Sure. I imagine a lot of our thoughts are in a similar vein. I think one of the most important things to do is practice putting some distance between us and our urges. There's a lot of different recommended practices for that. The one that we use and teach in our app is called STAR. It's an acronym to give us some space between taking action on our urge and feeling the urge. Do you want to talk about STAR a little bit?
Yeah, STAR, essentially it reflects taking a step back. So step back, which is big to that pausing or distancing yourself from that. We get into this fight or flight moment where we kind of get into this the current of our decisions where we don't feel like really in control, like cause and effect. This trigger happens, and then immediately after this result occurs based on that trigger, where if we can separate that a little bit and give some distance, like you're saying, that trigger can occur. We can see a billboard for something that triggers us, or we can have a smell that triggers us, or an environment that can trigger us to act out in the ways that we don't want to. And if we can step back, which is S, step back, take a few conscious breaths, so being deliberate about breathing and slowing down, asking yourself what you really want, back to the desires, and then respond in a healthy way. Just that slow process of practicing STAR, slowing down process can really help us reorient and not just getting swept into the current of that moment, but really kind of focusing and saying, actually, I'm going to go this way instead, and I'm going to ground myself with my desires, and I'm going to turn this way. There's other things that we can do, like urge surfing that we talk about. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I think that's something you're on a roll if you want to keep talking about it. But the idea, you might be more familiar and versed with urge surfing than I am.
Sure. Give us the idea.
Sure. Taking the analogy, right, of like sometimes our urges feel like a wave. They come and they sweep us away. We get washed along with them. So urge surfing is about how do we reorient ourselves to just ride along with the wave, not let it overtake us and overwhelm us. How do we and which has a lot to do with mindfulness practices.
It is. It's very much a mindfulness practice, and it's very much separating the urge from us. Again, if we can be conscious of the fact that this urge is something, almost like visualize the urge kind of existing outside of us and saying, okay, it's going to swell like as a wave might, right? It's going to swell and it's going to get hard. But studies have shown that these urges subside naturally without, even just through observation, not even through taking action, although that can help speed that process up, but it can subside. And if you just give it time, take a minute, take 60 seconds and just let it swell within you. You can kind of like close your eyes to help you kind of focus, and you can watch that urge symbolically rise and then kind of diminish, and then you can kind of like open your eyes back up and say, okay, I'm good. Right. So in that moment of the trigger where that urge comes, urge surfing is a powerful way to navigate that, and again, not just get swept up. So urge surfing, these are really great tactics that people can use. There are other ways of reframing the exact same process, but we really encourage people to think of those things.
Right. Put some distance between yourself, and all the groundwork we talked about is relevant, right? Recognizing you're not your urge, building awareness to even see like, oh, I have this craving right now. What's going on here? How did I get into this pattern and this loop? So these things, they sound simple, but practicing them and developing fluency with them is really important. It takes time.
Awesome.
Hope that's helpful for you.
Okay, we're going to go to another question. I'm going to go, this is an anonymous attendee, and it says, are there any ways to help other people that are trying to change, that are feeling really down on themselves or thinking that they are their struggle or vice? And this is a really good question. I'm glad that this question was asked, because it really gets to the fact that, sometimes we've talked a lot about what do we do as we struggle with our own struggle. But there's a lot of people that are, spouses of or friends with or, in the vicinity of individuals that are struggling. And how do we help those individuals? How do we support those individuals? How do we help them when they themselves are like, I am my addiction?
Yeah.
You said it in the beginning, and before I kind of turn it back over to you, you said in the beginning of this Q&A section that you said, look, or right before, this is something that cannot be done for you.
Right.
And you need others.
Right.
And that's an interesting paradox. But the whole, this can't be done for you is challenging for the individual, the spouse or the individual that's wanting to help, but you don't want help.
Yeah. This is a great, topic of conversation of how do we help other people change. And we're working on developing a more formalized curriculum for people, supporting other people in overcoming addiction or healing from mental health. I think there's a lot of principles from like cognitive behavioral therapy that are interesting. Like, how do we speak aloud and recognize the thoughts that are limiting and entrapping? So if you're encountering someone who is saying like, I'm never gonna get better, or this is who I am, I'm defined by this, in whatever ways they're saying it, right? Helping articulate, and there's a lot of ways that we can like expand that conversation, for even as simple as adding like the word yet, right? Like, I haven't figured this out. That's a discouraging statement. And then tag on like yet. And then suddenly it's more expansive, right? That we can, and there's a lot of ways to try to be more specific, and we can help. It doesn't really work well to be like, you're wrong, you're not this, like, let me tell you why. But we can reflect back to other people. I can see that you're in a lot of pain right now. I can see that you're hurting and that you're discouraged. I can see that you're worried that it's not ever going to get better. I've seen a lot of growth and change, or the fact that I see you still trying is really inspiring to me. And I think that there's good things to come. Those are different ways to engage that aren't so not getting stuck as the like, you're wrong, and make them kind of have to like hunker down and prove that, no, I'm right because I've failed this many times or whatever. So I think that's my initial thought about that question. I
think shame can often play a role in that dynamic, where an individual that's trying to help somebody can unintentionally put a lot of I don't want to. It's not that they are, shaming them necessarily intentionally, but the individual can feel a lot of shame from them because there's just a lot of disappointment, a lot of discouragement, a lot of better. How could you, all these kinds of things. I think when love is the foundation, and I think that we've gone through some wonderful questions to ask yourself.
Yep.
I think that a spouse or somebody close to that individual can help them go through those questions.
Sure.
And can sit down with them in a moment of sobriety, a moment of healthy dialogue, where their tensions aren't so high,
right.
Where it isn't in the moment of conflict, but rather, and bring up some of these questions like, what do you really want?
Right.
What is worth running toward?
Right.
And as a healthy, self-reflective discussion, again, helping them discover for themselves those answers. Because if you're trying to give those answers to them, again, it's not going to work. We know that. But if we can help be an agent to spark that light for those individuals that are struggling, and it could take time. Patience is a big part of this process. And it may not be as quick as you would want as the partner. It may not happen in the exact way you would want. It may there might be setbacks along the way, and recognizing that that's part of the process of healing, that it's not going to be overnight, right. That it's going to be a process, and you have to get comfortable with that process, and you have to be there to help pick them up. But I think in a moment of calm, to walk through some of those questions with that individual and helping them answer could be a very helpful process to
right.
to inspire them to be their own. Again, they can't do it. They can't rely on others to do this for
right.
them. You have to be their cheerleader, their champion, and their ally in that process. And that can be a difficult place to be, and you might need to involve others, professionals and others, to be a part of that team. But that's what, in addition to everything you said, that's what I would add to that.
Great. And we'll have more resources coming.
Yes, we have more
about how to
coming
help
on
other
that.
people.
Let's go with one more question before we conclude here. Here is another anonymous attendee. It says, you mentioned 2 books on addiction at the top of the presentation. What are they again? Well, we'll do that one. We'll do one more, but
sure.
Just rattle those off real quick.
Sure. The 2 books that I mentioned are both by Dr. Judson Brewer, The Craving Mind and Unwinding Anxiety. They're both excellent and talk about how he goes into great depth about habit loops and how do we recognize rewards and retrain our brain to respond more effectively.
Okay, and then here is the last question. How do you become more aware of what your reward for your habit is? Like with anxiety, for example, what's the reward of anxiety or worry?
Yeah, love this question. And so how do we become more aware of the rewards? There's some of that's like introspection, right? Thinking, researching, seeing yourself. You can try to get feedback from other people about what they think might be going on for you. And some of that is into diving into the research that's out there. So specifically, what's the reward of anxiety or worry? That's the whole subject of Dr. Brewer's book, the Unwinding Anxiety. And he positions worry as a behavioral response to the uncomfortable feelings of anxiety, and that worrying feels like we're doing something about. It feels like worrying feels better than not worrying about something because it feels like we're maybe can influence it or change it or showing that we care at least. So the reward is like responding. It's some sort of response to our negative feelings, which can then let us at least feel like we're doing something. The problem is what we're doing is not actually helpful and supportive for us. So I hope that answers that question at least in part. We have more resources about that, but a lot of it, but we can assume for sure there's a reason you're doing what you're doing. We wouldn't keep going back to things unless they were doing something for us. And maybe and some of that can be useful to try and figure out with a therapist or a professional. Maybe it's like, I think sometimes in my own habits, things that I'm trying to overcome, sometimes what it gives me is confirmation that I am, sometimes I'm worried that I'm bad, and my behaviors give me confirmation, well, I was right. That's the kind of person I am. And that's kind of twisted, right? It's not like a great reward. So I think bringing a sense of kind of humorous curiosity to our silly minds and the ways they build these habits that don't actually always serve us very well. So I hope that's a helpful answer to becoming more aware.
Thank you so much, Christian, for joining us.
Happy to
this
be
has
here.
been fun.
Thank
This
you
has been a good discussion. Thank you all for joining us live, and for those that are watching this after the live session. And thank you for all the questions and participation that you gave us. Next month, we're going to be talking about emotions and managing and navigating difficult emotions, and we're excited to have that conversation. So join us. Stay tuned for more information as to when that will be, and look out for the resource that we're going to be pushing out on urges. So again, thank you guys so much. We appreciate it. See you later.